When I look deep into my soul, when I'm really, really sad about stuff, usually what I find is that I'm not sad about just one thing. There's a collection of stuff, ironies, metaphors, narratives, past failures, things I tell myself, things I wish that had happened but that didn't, things that were good that I left undone, things that were bad that I actively participated in, the weather being off, my sports team playing poorly. I mean, it snowballs, right? When you're really, really down about stuff, everything can feed into that narrative. Sometimes it's probably not justified, and that's just the dark parts of our mind, our soul, our insecurity, our self-doubt getting the best of us for a little bit. Other times, well, maybe a good percentage of it is justified. Maybe we really are in a down and miserable spot, a place like where we find Job in the book that bears his name here a few pages over in the Bible from Esther that we're looking at. But when stuff is really genuinely bad, when you really genuinely have deep heartache, what I find is there's usually one big thing that is there that you can point to, but there's a lot of little stuff and a lot of layers to that pain as well. And I think Mordecai the Jew would have been feeling a lot of layers to his pain and his grief beyond the very obvious issue, which of course is Xerxes and Haman's edict that all of the Jews are going to be killed in a matter of just months here as we get into Esther chapter 4. Mordecai, understandably, makes a very public display of that pain and sorrow in Esther chapter 4, where it says, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. Here's my list in no particular order of the layers that I imagine might have been there for him. 1, the issuance of the initial edict overlaps with Passover. Also, the execution of this thing comes real close to overlapping with Passover. So it feels like there's a cruel irony in all of this, that God, who was there to be found before in Egypt when there was a threat to all of the Jews, the Hebrews there, now, where is he? His name doesn't even appear in this book. What's going on here? It feels like what's happening is a cruel mockery, a twisting, a perversion, a reversal of the idea of Passover. I think that's one reason. Another reason, speaking of Passover, is that the whole tension is born out of Mordecai being passed over for a promotion, for a reward. Instead of Mordecai being honored for sitting at the city gates, attentively overhearing stuff and saving the king, his enemy, Haman, is the one who receives that honor. Probably a third, ironically cruel layer to his grief is that, speaking of sitting at the city gates and hearing a plot and saving somebody's life, now here he is standing outside those same city gates where he got things right and he and his people weren't rewarded, and now he's wailing in sackcloth and ash at a much greater, grander, violent scheme, and it seems that there's nothing he can do to solve this one. While he was there earlier to deliver the king from an evil plot, it seems like no one is present now to deliver him and his people from an evil plot. I think another layer to his grief would be that the plot is at the hands of somebody who has wanted to plunder and destroy his people since forever, and it probably culturally looked to the Jewish people like they were out of the woods from the Agagite threat, the Amalekite threat, but now it's become the greatest threat of all, or at least the greatest threat since Pharaoh all the way back in Egypt. And even a further narrative layer to that grief would be that back in the days when it seemed like God was closer and Mordecai's people were hearing from God more, God actually said, you need to deal with these people who are actively trying to destroy you. You need to put an end to this rivalry once and for all. But Mordecai's ancestors, including King Saul, were more interested in turning them into tribute payers, some sort of object of plunder for years and years to come, instead of just eliminating the threat. Again, moral challenges of talking about Bronze Age rivalries in the ancient Near East aside. But then a further yet layer to this grief is exactly that issue of plunder, that it all started with the Amalekites trying to plunder Mordecai's ancestors during the desert wandering. The plunder is what tempted King Saul and caused him to get it wrong in response to these people who were trying to destroy once and for all the Jewish people. And that now, in yet another cruel reversal, this whole edict is underscored with the promise that the common men and women, the neighbors of the Jewish people, are going to get to lay plunder to all of their stuff after they slaughter them in one violent, decisive, genocidal day. I think another layer of grief for Mordecai has got to be that things seemed like they were going so well. He saved the king's life. Esther won the competition and is the queen. She is well positioned. This should have been a golden age of thriving for the Jewish people while under the leadership of the Persians. The prophets even said that the Persians were going to liberate the Jewish people and let them go and rebuild, that Cyrus was God's chosen instrument. And now it looks like things have gone so off the rails that none of that is going to happen. But I think the deepest, most painful level of Mordecai's grief, a gentleman who comes off as shrewd, self-aware, astute, understanding of human nature throughout the rest of the book of Esther, I think the deepest level of despair is that surely he's got to feel at some level like this is his fault. He could have just bent the knee to that guy. But he made a judgment call and was like, no, I'm not doing it. As we discussed, we don't totally know why, what his motivation was in choosing that issue over which to take a stand. But he did. And maybe his attitude was, I'm not going to do it. And if I perish, I perish. So what? I will not bend the knee to this thing, not anticipating that there would be a wild overreaction to this personal insult felt by Haman that would result in Mordecai's refusal to comply, bringing about the death of everyone from his people group. Even if you're really sure you were right, that's still going to be a very heavy emotional burden to bear. There are probably some of you listening to this who can relate to Mordecai's decision. You've seen things in the last however many years where you're like, no, that's just too much. And I understand that I'm going to pay a significant price for not going along with this thing or that thing, but I just can't do it, and I'm not going to do it. And then you have paid a significant price. But maybe some of you have seen your decisions or the stands you've taken also bring about hardship for people you love who didn't have anything to do with it. That's got to be a pretty brutal thing to live with, and Mordecai has that hanging squarely around his neck right here. All that said, there is a very old motif in storytelling. It's the darkest before the dawn, the storytelling beat or storytelling motif. And in the case of this story of the book of Esther, we're getting pretty close to that pivot point where solutions and responses to this mess, this impending evil calamity, are starting to take shape. More on that next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
Thank you to all of you who have taken the time to leave a rating and review on your podcast apps. We're grateful because it's encouraging and it helps new people find their way here.